All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming back to us after our morning session. I'm Chad Koulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber. We're really happy to be joined by one of the most respected reporters we have that covers politics in Minnesota. I heard her speak at a First Fridays event at St. Thomas a few years ago and thought we got to get her to speak one day. And we finally got her. So I'm really excited to hear what her insights are. This is recorded. That's one of the nice things about virtual is when you have recorded events, you can follow up with them afterward. You can send them to people. So even if you're not here, you can still enjoy it later. Our sponsor today is Comcast, and Allison is here. She gave a nice speech earlier about some of the things that Comcast is working on, particularly Comcast Rise. Allison, would you like to say anything else? You're on mute too.
Chad, and thank you very much. I'm Allison Hartle. I am the Vice President of State Government Affairs for Comcast in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Comcast is really excited to be supporting the Midway Chamber of Commerce as a sponsor of this event. Comcast would like me to take a moment to tell you about Comcast Rise. Comcast Rise is part of our Project Up, Comcast's comprehensive initiative to advance digital equity, and was designed to help provide underrepresented small business owners with access to the digital tools and funding they need to survive. The program aims to uplift and support small BIPOC businesses hardest hit by the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. By the end of 2022, Comcast Rise will award 14,000 small businesses owned by women and people of color across the country with monetary grants, technology makeovers, and marketing services. In celebration of its one-year anniversary, Comcast Rise will expand to include all women-owned small businesses nationwide. This is happening in 2022, and this is regardless of race or ethnicity. Applications open January 16th, and I encourage you to visit www.comcastrise.com. And that's Comcast Rise, one word. I'll pop this in the chat as I did during the legislative series or summit. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Chad, and good to see you, Mary.
Thank you, Allison. And we will be sure to also include that link in our newsletter next week and promote it on social media, just like we did for another Comcast opportunity, a grant that they had done earlier last year now, for minority-owned businesses. So thanks for the good work that Comcast is doing in our community. As I mentioned, this is a virtual event, as you can see, even though it's great for convenience and it's great for recording. And we have had a few people who say they want to check out the recording afterward. We do miss seeing everybody in person, and we hope we can be back in person. That's our plan for February 16th, when we're going to be joined by Lewis King, who's got a very interesting story. His speech is Summit 2025, How to Get to the Middle Class. And we look forward to that. And that's hopefully going to be at TST Creative Catering on Dale Street. And at this time, I want to turn it over to our board chair, Sabrina Fay.
All right. Thank you, Chad. As many of you know, my name is Sabrina Fay. I'm with the Pathways team at Thrivent. And I want to remind everybody that exactly 1 month, we are about 1 month away from our biggest event of the year, the annual celebration. So on February 26th, once again, we'll have our cocktail reception and dinner. We'll have our electronic auction with many wonderful items, and we'll also have a live auction and our annual leadership awards. And we are still also accepting applications for our leadership awards. So if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, we'll ask you to get those in. And we are back in person this year at the Intercontinental. So I hope that we will see you there. I also want to offer a big thank you to our major sponsors. We have our title sponsor, Spire Credit Union. Our presenting sponsor is Thrivent Pathways team, Highway Credit Union, and Riverland Bank. Our theme this year is Venetian Carnival, and you will be getting an official invite in the mail soon if you haven't already received it. In the meantime, consider joining the list of sponsors, donating an auction, or nominating someone for the Leadership Award. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker today. Mary, she has been a program host and political reporter for TPT Twin Cities PBS since 1998. She has won many regional Emmys and numerous other awards in several states for her anchoring, reporting, producing, and photography. She was named one of the best Capitol reporters in America by the Washington Post, best TV reporter by Minnesota Monthly, and best newscaster by City Pages magazine. Her trademark has been getting politicians to open up and trust her. She has produced a variety of documentaries and programs on topics such as global trade missions, Minnesota history, and farm to table cooking. Please welcome her for this afternoon's presentation.
Thank you very much. I think this is where I just jump in. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks,
and welcome
Mary.
you to my home office studio, where if folks have been watching Almanac and the pieces we've been contributing almost for a couple of years now, this has been the backdrop as all of us transition to this new work model. And Chad and I were talking during the break about how lawmaking is a hybrid model right now. Again, somewhat unexpected, because we are now in our third legislative session of kind of a hybrid work model. The Minnesota House is going to be virtual and in person, so truly that hybrid. The state Senate is planning to do most in person, but still offer online options. The governor, as we talked about, has been doing a lot of press conferences in person, but often outdoors. So I was saying earlier, there's almost kind of a politics to how you do your press conferences, where you do them, indoors, outdoors, masks, no masks, distanced, not distanced. We're still seeing all of that really play out in how the media is dealt with and how politicians are presenting their messages to us. I'm going to talk about session and what we see. This is from our perspective, which is nonpartisan. I work for Almanac and Almanac at the Capitol at PBS. We don't pick sides. We don't have favorites. We just say our viewers are smart enough to decide for themselves, that we don't have to tell you what to think or how to think. And I've been in training for this job my entire life. I'm not sure if anyone on the call has been around long enough, because I've already been around a long time. As you heard, started at TPT in 98 and interned there in college in the early 90s, and got to spend one session with my father, who was also a political reporter from the Associated Press. He spent 36 years covering state government, and I ran around after him at the Capitol and really fell in love with it. And he taught me very well about respecting, yet pushing and questioning both sides of the aisle and not picking favorites. And I still hear from lawmakers all the time what a great job he did at being a very fair and nonpartisan voice in covering the Capitol. And he was a really great role model, and still is. Actually, he's 89 years old and still around, and was brought out of retirement every year for the election. So if you ever hear that phrase, the AP has called the election for so-and-so, that was actually my dad. So that was his specialty. He's a mathematical genius. So he can calculate all those numbers, and he knows when every precinct, district, everything is in, and he can call a race in any part of the state. And he did that for 50 years for Minnesota, for the Associated Press, and he never got a race wrong. So I'm pretty proud of it, including the one race that went to a recount that he refused to call because he said it was too close to call, and others had called, I believe, Coleman Franken, and he, I believe, refused to call that one because it was too close. So anyway, that's just kind of big picture of where I come from and doing this job with public broadcasting. And what we'll be looking for this session, I peeked in a little bit earlier on some lawmakers and some of the discussion, and it sounds like everybody's pretty well versed on what the issues will be. And I think the biggest issue is the record-setting largest budget surplus in state history. That $7.7 billion number is enormous. There are very different takes on, though, how to look at it. I just came from Senate Republicans the last hour laying out their priorities for session. And it was clear, Senator Julia Coleman was clear in saying, this is not good news to her. She said a surplus means we're over collecting and the government's taking too much and it needs to go back. So Senate Republicans said one of their top priorities is going to be long-term permanent tax relief. They didn't put numbers on it. When we were questioned, they said it sounds like it's going to hit many different income brackets, but we're waiting for specifics on that with the budget surplus. And it also means there's money to invest. And it's something I'll talk about much more, and maybe folks will want to talk more about it because it's really an emerging issue, is public safety and Senate Republicans and Democrats are talking about spending on improving public safety. Republicans were just talking about officer retention bonuses, recruitment and retention bonuses, scholarships to get folks to go into law enforcement with some of the shortages there. So that's some of the things they'll be spending money on. The governor this week has been rolling out all of his budget priorities. He went to schools and talked education, more money for pre-K, K-12, childcare. And then a big Democratic priority is paid family leave. House Democrats have made it very clear that that is one of their top priorities, again, to try to push paid family leave. They've passed it before. It's hard to get it through Senate Republicans. And again, big picture, many of you may know this, but we do have the only divided legislature in the nation. So Senate Republicans, House Democrats, and a Democrat governor. So it's not easy. Everything has to be bipartisan to get through. So we'll definitely talk about all of those layers on all the major issues. You know, the other thing is this year, these even years are usually bonding years. That's what we call them. You know, odd years are usually budget years. Even years are usually bonding years for major state construction projects. And last week, the governor rolled out his $2.7 billion package, which would be the largest. Now, there always had been kind of an artificial barrier of lawmakers not wanting to go past $1 billion. Well, they have done that now. So it feels as if, as the governor said, that artificial barrier of $1 billion has broken. And we would expect probably another $1 billion+ bonding bill. We'll see what comes out. You know, always higher education is a huge part of that, what we call asset preservation. So improving and preserving the state's existing assets, but usually building some new things and funding some new things. So we'll see. Again, that has to be bipartisan in each chamber. Super majorities are required to be built around those. So that'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, especially in light of the federal money that's coming our way. So not only do we have a $7.7 billion budget surplus that is Minnesota dollars coming from Minnesota taxpayers, but we have billions, estimated around $6 billion of federal money also coming to the state through federal legislation. And we'll see, you know, if that decreases the appetite for bonding. That's something we'll be watching, whether the state wants to borrow money when all this cash is coming in. Now, some of the proposals and the governor's proposal does have cash in it because the state is pretty flush with cash and a lot of this federal infrastructure money coming in. Now, part of the nuance of some of those federal dollars is they are matching dollars. So the state legislature does need to act to trigger many, many, many projects. You have to put a little skin in where there's maybe as much as 80% of the federal money coming in if the state just puts down, you know, 20%. So there's quite a bit of interest in the state trying to move pretty quickly to get a piece of that federal matching money into the tune of billions of dollars of infrastructure. Definitely would be watching that. Another issue, and maybe because I'm a public television geek, but it's something I've paid a lot of attention to, is we are in that every 10-year census and redistricting process. And that has a huge impact on Minnesota politics. You know, I've been around for several decades now and have seen the mass retirements and the major change that comes. And Minnesota's demographics are shifting pretty dramatically. You know, a major loss of population in rural areas, the exurbs gaining, the suburbs gaining, urban areas definitely holding, if not gaining population. And seats are required to change according to the state statute. Lawmakers are supposed to do it. They are supposed to be redrawing the legislative and congressional lines. Just coming out of the Senate Republican press conference, we asked several questions about that. It's sounding doubtful. New Senate Majority Leader Miller said, you know, we got the numbers late from the federal government, so it's hard for us to have enough time to do that. I'd heard some interest that maybe the legislature could do the congressional lines, which, you know, 8 boundaries are much easier to draw than 201 boundaries in the legislature. Senator Miller just said it's all or nothing. That he said if the legislature doesn't do legislative districts, they're not doing congressional districts. So I would say, as it has been pretty much my whole lifetime, it's unlikely that the legislature will come together and draw those maps, and that the courts will again do that. The courts after February 15th would come out with maps if the legislature cannot act. And the panel has already been holding hearings across the state and taking a lot of input from various parties on how to redraw those lines. And they should be pretty different. Like we say, the loss of rural population is a big deal. And we've seen shifts of where politics works in the state. Rural areas are increasingly Republican, urban, very Democrat, suburban, first ring, a little has been moving more Democratic, but exurbs very competitive to Republican. Joe Mansky, if folks remember Joe Mansky from Ramsey County and State Secretary of State, is one of the deepest minds on redistricting. And Joe, just the other day, I was talking to him and he said, take 494 and draw a line outside of that. And he said, that's the purple border of the state. That's where every race will be decided. That's where all the biggest, most important swing districts. So he says, it's a Maple Grove, about there, outside of 494 and around. That is the area to watch. And that's incredibly competitive and where races will be decided. And what also happens with redistricting, I mentioned mass retirements, we could see dozens, we could see 40, 50, as much as a fourth of the legislature will likely turn over. And we know there's certainly going to be a good amount because many have already announced their retirement. So this year on Almanac at the Capitol, I'll give a pitch for our show. So many of you may know Almanac on Friday nights at 7. During the legislative session, we do Almanac at the Capitol. Wednesday night, it's all politics and all Minnesota politics and government Wednesday nights. And when I saw some of these major names announcing their retirements and knowing that redistricting was coming, I thought, well, let's do some really candid, honest, and often emotional interviews with lawmakers who are leaving and can say whatever they want now. I used to always say it's a cliche that the most honest politician is a retiring one or a former one. So these interviews, I've already done a handful of them, almost half a dozen. Names like Alice Hausman, Carlos Mariani, Rod Hamilton, Tim Miller, some of those real long-term, incredibly impactful, we're talking people, 20, 30 years of experience in the legislature, and some of them very bipartisan and have reached across the aisle. Fascinating to hear them and their parting advice. And there's definitely themes emerging from all these retiring lawmakers of the secret friendships across the aisle that nobody knew about and how those are some of their most treasured memories. And there are some shocking ones that nobody knew about, secret breakfast buddies and across the aisle alliances. And I'm finding out a lot in talking to these retiring lawmakers, and there will only be more of them coming. And sure, a handful of lawmakers who are leaving and retiring are doing so for higher office. And if you look at both the House and the Senate, the majority leaders are leaving or already have left their positions. In the Senate, Jeremy Miller, kind of a young, seen as a little more open-minded, bipartisan. He was in the Purple Caucus from Winona. He's the new Senate majority leader. The Senate also has a new minority leader in Melissa Lopez Franzen from Edina, a suburb that was entirely Republican not that long ago and now has flipped to entirely Democratic in its representatives and senators. So she represents the changing face of the party there. So new leaders, and both of them have, a history of being more moderate and bipartisan. So it'll be interesting to see how much the Senate changes. And then over in the House, Majority Leader Ryan Winkler, of course, is leaving for a run for Hennepin County Attorney. So really interesting changes that will be coming there. We can talk about more of that. And then all the candidates for governor, and the state Senate seems to be the place to find candidates for governor. Former Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, former Health Chair Michelle Benson, former state senator and Dr. Scott Jensen. Those seem to be the leading contenders. Kendall Qualls, who ran for Congress in the West Metro, recently got in. We're hearing possibly Rich Stanek, former state lawmaker, former public safety commissioner, who was fired by Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty. There's some interest in Stanek. Then he went on to become Hennepin County Sheriff and lost that race. And so there still seems to be some interest and intrigue around a new candidate, somebody to challenge Walz, who on paper and just by anecdote seems perhaps more vulnerable than he was last time. He won by a record amount of votes, but came from a rural district. He had represented southern Minnesota swing district that was won by a Republican after he left. So he's had to govern through a lot of very difficult times, George Floyd, the unrest after that, the racial reckoning, and a pandemic and increased crime. So it's not going to be a fun or easy race for him, certainly for governor. but Democrats still seem to have the advantage in statewide races. Democrats have every single statewide office in Minnesota. Republicans are working hard to end that long stretch. And folks often ask, what can Republicans do to win a statewide race? And you say, well, who's the last person who did it? Who's the last Republican who won the race for governor? And that was Tim Pawlenty, also a person who came from the state legislature and came from local government, which many of you may know that, he was in city council in Eagan. He was a suburban dad, lawyer who came through local government, came through Eagan City Council, came to the state legislature, became majority leader, then a candidate for governor, and then a candidate almost for vice president, and then a candidate for president. So interesting trajectory in that he was, a suburban dad who took some more moderate stances, who was open on issues like climate change, and then, had to walk some of that back later. But that seemed to be the last formula for winning, along with there being a strong third party. So the last time Republicans won statewide was not that long after Jesse Ventura and the state still having a very strong independence third party movement, which we haven't seen in the race for governor basically since that time. So definitely be watching the race for governor, watching how congressional districts will be redrawn and get more competitive. We fascinate the rest of the nation. I can't tell you how many times I get asked from people in Washington about that. And I also work for the NewsHour at National PBS, and they keep saying, what's up with Minnesota? How are you guys so evenly divided? They look at our congressional delegation, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, several of those seats just recently flipped. And they say, how is that possible? How is there really, a purple state, an evenly divided state? And it goes back to what I was referencing earlier too, about how and who draws our lines, and the fact that partisan lawmakers don't draw our lines, haven't been successful at it. And that our judiciary and a panel of judges who were appointed by a variety of governors. If you look at the current panel, they were all appointed by 3 different governors: Republican governor, Democratic governor, and Independence Party governor. So it is a balanced, nonpartisan, and judicial races in Minnesota have remained relatively nonpartisan. There was a slight attempt to do some endorsements that didn't go well for one party, but our judiciary is really well known and respected for being incredibly politically independent and then drawing very competitive lines. So that's how we end up with the only divided legislature in the nation, 50-50 split in our congressional delegation. That to me is just fascinating. The rest of the country doesn't really understand what's the deal in Minnesota and how we could really be so divided or balanced, depending on how you want to look at it. So that'll be interesting to see. And then I also, to come back to public safety as an issue, it is the number one issue for Republicans heading into this legislative session, addressing it, heading into the legislative session and into the November elections. And they know there's polling and there's tons of anecdotal evidence. And just today, Senate Majority Leader Miller opened with, people are scared and our number one priority is public safety. And people are afraid of carjackings and robberies and theft. And so public safety is an issue we didn't necessarily see coming a year or two ago, that would be the number one priority for Senate Republicans, and for Republicans to also know, as they're crunching numbers and looking at things behind the scenes, they know it's an issue that they are polling on probably better than Democrats at this point. So they've been pushing the narrative for sure that Democrats are soft on crime. Minnesota's a parole state, that we've been releasing folks. And so there's a push on the Republican side to be tougher on crime, to enforce existing laws and sentencing, and as well as enhanced sentencing. Judiciary Chair Senator Warren Limmer just announced that he will be pushing legislation to increase penalties for carjackers who use violence, produce a gun or an assault during carjacking, and sentencing on that. So they are definitely pushing a tough on crime narrative and are hearing from folks in the suburbs, because again, that's where races are decided. If you want to win control of the state house, the state senate, a statewide office, you have to win suburbs and exurbs. That's where races are decided. The rest is not very competitive anymore outside of that. Now, population centers, Rochester, St. Cloud, those can get much more competitive and will be. But in terms of, pulling enough quantity of votes, public safety is an issue that is resonating in suburban areas, and definitely we'll be hearing a lot about that. We'll continue to hear about COVID too. Also in this press conference, Roger Chamberlain, education chair, said, his priority is going to be no masks and no more homeschool, hybrid virtual school. No masks, and get the kids in person no matter what going forward. So we're still figuring out the impact of COVID, and the governor has some mental health money in his budget proposal as well to help kids who are really struggling. I was just at a doctor's appointment earlier today, and my doctor was saying the two groups that she's the most concerned about are the young and the old, and that they got affected and impacted by COVID the most. And we know just statistically that the older you are, generally the harder COVID was if you caught it, and kids not being in the classroom and how hard that was on them. So COVID's still definitely a political issue. And I don't think we'll see the governor, do a mask mandates or state of emergency or anything that sweeping again. But we also have some leftover issues from that. The legislature did approve the frontline worker pay, bonus pay for folks who were really out there in the front line. They already approved it. They haven't figured out how to allot it yet. They were supposed to do that. They have been unable. It is a priority early in session to figure out how to get that frontline worker bonus pay out, as well as the unemployment insurance pool that is in need of being repaid. And it sounds like there's bipartisan interest in that, and as well as bipartisan interest again in getting some of that federal money allotted and released for the state. So we'll be keeping an eye on those issues related to COVID. And then, as we mentioned earlier, George Floyd and the racial reckoning, the state did pass some criminal justice reform, but equity really continues to be a major issue. I think about some of the retirement interviews I did just talking to Carlos Mariani and how frustrated he is that the state hasn't made more inroads in things like education, that our achievement gap is still so high, and probably worse. We don't know the new numbers after COVID, but addressing some of the issues we have in equity in education, in housing as well. And, the news that just arrived within the last day or so that the federal rent assistance money is out and that's going away. That's another housing issue. And Chair Mariani was saying, his biggest issue with education is homelessness, and that you can't detach housing from education and how much they're related. So that's what I'll be looking for. And I would say, the stories that get a little extra credit with me are folks who actually get things done and are bipartisan and who work across the aisle, because that's the only way you can get legislation passed in Minnesota. That's kind of the overview of the big issues that I'll be looking at. I think we have time for questions, don't we, to interact a little bit?
Yes, we do. Thanks, Mary. We definitely have time for questions. And similar to what we were doing for the morning session, feel free to either put a question in chat or to just raise your hand and we'll call on you. And if we have it in chat, we probably would still just have you say it so we could hear directly from you. I can start, Mary. You mentioned the divide and how Minnesota seems so 50-50 red versus blue. And it wasn't that long ago, as you were saying, suburban markets like Edina were red. Now they're either purple or blue. You look at a lot of greater Minnesota that used to be blue, right? Iron Range was always blue, and now it's definitely looking a lot redder than it used to be. That's been the trend in the past few years. Can you look into a crystal ball and make a prediction? What's next in these trends on where the red and blue goes?
I'll quote Joe Mansky again, Ramsey County elections guy, because I did an interview with Joe recently and I'd known this story, but he finally put it on the record. Mansky worked for Independence Party Governor Jesse Ventura on redistricting 20 years ago. And he has a presentation 20 years ago where he said all of northern Minnesota will turn Republican, and jaws dropped. Nobody believed him. Nobody could see it coming. No way. They said not possible, because that was, union territory, mining, farmer labor. That was the FNL and DFL. And Joe said, no, that will flip. And then he also told people, and the suburbs, all the first ring and probably second ring suburbs will go from Republican to Democrat. So he absolutely saw that coming in. People did not believe him. He said, southern Minnesota will continue to be competitive, but probably start trending Republican. He saw that coming. So again, I asked him, what does he see coming? Because reporters don't generally make predictions, but we try and find smart people who do. And what Joe said is what I referenced earlier is you take that map of 494 and you just push out 494 and out. So suburbs and exurbs, and draw that circle around the metro. And that is where the races will be decided and to be determined on what they do, and issues that we don't see coming, like COVID, kids in the classroom, not in the classroom. That's a huge suburban issue. Public safety with carjackings pushing out now into the suburbs and stories, that could change some issues as well. So we don't know quite yet of how those issues will play in those swing areas that have been moving Democratic, but are not fully there. And there's, we know there's anger and angst and displeasure out there with leadership.
Great. Thank you. Maria Mitchell has a comment saying, Mary, I've appreciated how on air and Almanac, there is an unbiased interviewing process. Is this a requirement for all who report on Almanac?
Yeah, I would say it's not just a requirement, but it's an expectation and a core belief, because we are public broadcasting and we are accountable to the public. And it's been successful. Almanac is the longest running, highest rated public affairs show in the history of local television. People still sit down Friday night and watch TV. And we think part of that is because we reflect our community, because Minnesotans are so incredibly engaged. We know we lead the nation in voter turnout. We're educated, every measure of that. We give because we are largely, the lion's share of our funding comes from the public, who decides if they like what we do or not. So we also, we give, we volunteer, we support arts. We have a really unique kind of secret sauce in Minnesota. And folks may not know this, but Almanac has been replicated in markets all over the United States, and nowhere has it been as successful. And other markets say, why didn't it work? I think there was like Almanac, Texas, and it just didn't work. And I always say it didn't work because they're not Minnesotans, because Minnesotans are just so incredibly engaged and smart. And I said at the beginning that we don't tell people what to think. We just give them really good information and hope that that's enough to help them make intelligent decisions on their own. And public broadcasting, I think, should be the place people can come to and see debates. You think of 1998, Jesse Ventura, most debates in Minnesota history. And we held many, many of those debates and gave, fair access and opportunities to a variety of candidates.
And did you mean to say that it's the longest running in Minnesota or the country?
In the country. It's the longest
Wow.
running, highest rated local public affairs show in the history of television.
That is really impressive. I didn't know that. Now, you mentioned, you were very complimentary there about how in Minnesota, we're educated, we're smart, we take all this into account, and we want to learn about the issues, which is great. But the perception definitely has been nationally, in particular, that we've gotten so divided, and people have been so, I'll just say, mean-spirited on any side of the aisle, and not being able to relate to people who disagree with them politically. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in Minnesota in regard to that? And I mean, is there some hope and optimism that the Minnesota nice is going to prevail out of all this?
No, it's a great question. And for a long time, early in my careers, Minnesota would kind of buck the trends. When you talk about, we elected a third party governor in 1998. It was not our first third party governor. Floyd B. Olson was a third party. So Minnesota has always had a bit of a populist libertarian streak, and that's still definitely true. But we have seen some of the national narrative and negativity and kind of hate and vitriol certainly sink in here. I'll go back to these interviews I've been doing the last couple of weeks with retiring lawmakers, and the biggest revelations that each of them provide. And it's the same theme, whether the lawmakers are rural, urban, suburban, Democrat, Republican, each of them say, the most important thing, the most valuable thing was friendships with people who are different than them, and pushing themselves and admitting they were wrong, and changing their minds on issues, and reaching out, and a rural Republican making friends with an urban Democrat and figuring out where they can work together. So I still think there is that appetite and interest in it. And I know when we hear from our viewers, they love it. That's why I say, I give extra credit to bipartisan legislation and partnerships. And that's what our viewers absolutely love. I did a story not long ago on all the federal transportation money coming in, and the Senate transportation chair and the House transportation chair of two different parties. And these two people saying, we got along great. The Senate unanimously passed a transportation bill, and how there are still some folks who can get it done and can work together, and you have to in our divided government. So yeah, it's can be frustrating and negative, but I still see and hear from a lot of lawmakers and viewers who love the bipartisan stories, and we get great feedback on that. Another one of our probably most watched stories and talked about was, Senator Tomassoni and his ALS diagnosis. And here's a Democrat who's caucusing with a Republican who calls himself an independent, and everybody in the state loved hearing from him, and nobody took a shot at him. I didn't get one negative comment of, well, he traded sides, or he's a traitor, or he's, not really a Democrat or not really a Republican. People all said, wow, what a public servant. They were, related to him as a human being and the struggle he's going through.
Yes. Great. I don't want to take all the questions. I can if nobody else has them, but I want to open it up again. Any questions? Somebody wants to feel free to unmute themselves and ask.
Chad, I've got a question along the same lines as the one that you asked. Whether you call the current political climate divided in Minnesota or balanced, however you mentioned those two optional ways of characterizing it. Do you think that the current tension that we have in our sort of governing institutions right now is helping to get things done, or is it a hindrance in Minnesota? I think not nationally, but here in Minnesota.
Well, we haven't shut down government in some time. We've done it a few times, but the current cast of characters has figured it out and kept government from shutting down, because in Minnesota, we have consequences. We can't run a deficit like a federal government. We really do have an honest shutdown. It's still a partial shutdown, but there's real incentives to get it done. And they still seem to be able to do that cycle after cycle. Even, the police reform that got through after George Floyd's murder, when that can't happen in DC, and that hasn't gone anywhere. So I think we're still performing better in terms of what's getting accomplished and not shutting down government and keeping things going. The tension, and it's not a new tension. I guess that's the other thing to think about, is while this extreme kind of gridlock in DC is a newer thing, in Minnesota, we've often had divided government. For those of you who've been around it a lot, the House changes, flip-flops all the time, and has for decades. That's always been incredibly competitive. We have had divided government off and on for much of the last couple of decades. So it's not something new. And many people would say that it does force folks to compromise and force towards the middle. My father, who's a brilliant observer of the legislature, always says that he sees freshmen come in on the far right and the far left. And over the years, he would see them come to the middle, because that's where everything's done. Good question. Yeah.
I'm going to have, Maria had asked a question in chat. I'm going to have her ask it, but before she does, I just want to mention the Chamber on a regular basis does a program called Lunch on the Line, where we go to different restaurants, give them business, show them support. We especially like to do it if there's road construction happening right in front of them, because we know that other people won't go there at the time. One person who I always like to email and say, hey, Maria, you should come, is Maria Mitchell, because she's normally good about wanting to check out new restaurants. So that ties into your question, Maria. Go ahead. Are you there, Maria? You might be on mute.
Can you tell that it's lunchtime? Hi, Mary. I sent a question. I qualified it by saying it's off topic of politics, but I so enjoy you and your other reporting. And that's when you go to these various places for restaurants on site with different farmers. I mean, all of that. I sit there and I'm glued to the TV because I appreciate it. You're very professional, but you're very warm and down to earth. So one of my questions was, do you accept suggestions? How do you go about selecting where you will go, and do you accept suggestions?
Thank you so much for the question. I kind of call that series, it's called the Farm Fresh Road Trip, where we travel the state and feature farmers and chefs who are working together. I call it my sanity plan. because politics can be a little difficult and a little negative. And if you've been to the state capitol, the press corps is located underground in windowless bunkers, and it's an intense long winter. So being able to get outside and travel the state and eat and drink and enjoy farmers and chefs is wonderful. And I feel like politically, I do have the space to do it because agriculture is a really nonpartisan, bipartisan issue. Even the years where government has shut down, the one budget bill that will get through the Capitol has been the ag bill. So it's a very depoliticized area of government that I think has given me a little space to do something as fun as Farm Fresh Road Trip. Unfortunately, we are not in production on the series anymore.
Oh, okay. Oh,
We
no.
aren't. My producing partner, we had worked with the Minnesota Farmers Union, who had created a lot of these friendships and partnerships. And some of you may know Bruce Miller, who was a lobbyist. Bruce passed away now 2 years ago. And the project in its current version kind of ended with him. But what we did do is we have a new cookbook out that's called Farmers and Chefs. And it was at one point the Midwest bestseller on Amazon, and it includes a lot of the stops that you may have enjoyed, and then the recipes of how to make all the things, because the number one request we would get after the show aired was, can I get the recipe? So we heard our viewers loud and clear and worked with a lot of the folks behind the scenes to create the Farmer and the Chef cookbook. So that is one way. I'd love to start it. Thank you for watching and enjoying it. Yeah.
Any thoughts of any new production in that area? Let the powers that be know that we want to see that kind of thing.
But what you need to do is you need to tell my bosses that at the station.
Just give me a name.
Absolutely. Okay. We will connect. I think on our website, if you head to tpt.org, there will be a comment section and say, I love that show, miss it. What can we do to bring it back?
Right. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, thank you.
Fun off-topic question. Thanks, Maria. Jerry Mono has a question. It says here, are we getting the younger generation involved in the political discussion? Jerry says he has 3 20-year-old plus children, and they don't seem to be interested. Mary, what are we doing?
It's not a new problem. It's kind of an ancient problem. We have the same problem at public television. We always say, we get you when you're really little and watch Sesame Street, and then you don't come back until you're an adult who pays taxes. So that's just reflects that political activism and voting is less among young people. And every election cycle, somebody tries that we're going to get the young people to turn out, we're going to excite them, and not a lot has. We see little blips here and there, and I think Obama got some younger people engaged, but not a significant number. Even Ventura, it's overstated how many young people came out to vote for him. It was more disaffected older voters, folks that hadn't voted in a long time. Kind of similar to the Trump voter too, kind of a forgotten, disengaged, libertarian, independent voter. So getting young people to show up has been hard. What we did see after George Floyd and the protests were a lot of young people showing up from various backgrounds, various parts of the state, showing up and protesting and really leaning in on that issue in particular. I don't know if that turned into, caring about public policy and voting and pushing through on that. It is kind of the problem of society is, and maybe that cliche is right, that until you pay taxes, you don't care about government, because that's your interaction with government.
Or a lot of times, maybe if there's an issue that specifically pertains to you, taxes is a major one for a lot of people, but if there's something else that maybe speaks to you,
environment, we have seen, pockets of young people really engage on environmental issues and care about that, but still not really huge, significant numbers. We did a story not long ago on Tom Swain. If you guys know Tom, who's kind of known as the Minnesota's best citizen, most engaged citizen, worked for Democrats, Republicans, University of Minnesota. Tom just turned 100 years old, and everybody was asking, what should we do? What should we do? And Tom said, let's solve climate change. And they all donated lots and lots of money to the University of Minnesota. And Tom is bringing in top speakers, Greta Thunberg, just huge names to the U to try and tackle it. Because he said he can't look at his grandkids and kids in the eye and say, I didn't try and do anything about the environment and climate change. And that's, a guy who has worked on both sides of the aisle and was listening to the younger generation that was the pressing issue they were seeing.
All right. We have time for some more questions. Oh, looks like Tony's asked one here. Other than the surplus and public safety, what other issues do you see getting attention this session?
Education is always an issue in Minnesota, being it's not a budget year, maybe not as much education policy, but I think the governor is showing that he's going to lean in hard on education by doing one of his budget events at a school and mentioning, the real crisis we have on childcare and still investments in pre-K, which was his predecessor's number one priority, Governor Mark Dayton. That was what he funded and really saw a lot of research, working with folks like Art Rolneck and seeing that early research. Probably another issue we don't see coming quite as much, but when we're seeing these workforce and supply chain shortages, I don't know what the state legislature exactly can do about that, but they're certainly talking about trying to address workforce shortages. I know Senate Republicans said they're going to have a specific plan to try and help long-term care and nursing homes, which are in crisis as well. I've got a sibling who's an executive, and it's unbelievable. I think last time I talked to him, he had over 2,000 job openings at his facilities, jobs he can't fill. So workforce shortages, also in transportation, trucking, moving goods. So something that the legislature might be able to do on that, because that's, a real issue for anyone who is out in society and in commerce, just getting things to your home, as we're increasingly reliant in COVID. And I think this is going to be a semi-permanent change, that we're all using delivery services far more than we have.
You brought up education, and education is just one example of an issue that's so big, has so many moving parts to it. But I saw so often last year in school board races that it seemed to be candidates were either the ones who were against mask policies and against distance learning, and the other candidates that were in favor of different mandates. And I'm curious, your perspective, what's it like when an issue that's so major gets just shaped by one particular priority? I mean, on one hand, it allows a lot of people to weigh in and to think about that issue, but is it just getting it too narrow at that point?
Yeah, and I hope that, we can somehow be the place where the complex conversations can happen, because, I worked in commercial news and know that, okay, if I had 60 seconds on air and I showed up to a school board meeting, you're probably just gonna have 60 seconds of two sides shouting at each other over one issue. But when I get 5 minutes to explain a story, then we could talk about the nuances of early childhood education and the payoff that has long-term, and funding, how we increase education K-12 funding every year, and are we getting results, and the persistent achievement gap, and what works, because we are not getting at it. And while Minnesota pats itself on the back, and I mentioned all the things we lead the nation in, and we do so well, and one of them has been SAT and ACT scores, until you break that out for race and you see how we lead the nation in disparities on achievement and education. And I think that's still the issue that Democrats and Republicans are trying to tackle and have not figured it out, and we have not made progress on. That's the nuanced, complicated thing above mask, no mask, in the classroom, not in the classroom. We haven't really seen probably critical race theory be the issue that it is in the rest of the country, because it's not really being proposed and talked about here. I think we'll continue to maybe see some attempts around some of those buzzwords, and that, because it has affected and changed races across the country. The other thing we do know is that we saw a record amount of retirements on school boards and folks who just didn't want to do it anymore.
We have time for another question. I don't want it to come from me, though. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask? Or comments, anything? Feel free to unmute if you do. All right, looks like everybody has asked the questions that they want to ask, although I can wrap up with one that I asked earlier for the senators. Small businesses have taken such a hit these past couple of years, restaurants in particular, but a lot of small businesses, and this is a K-shaped recovery for the economy. What do you think session could take up this year, or have you heard they're taking up, that could help small businesses?
I've heard ideas in theory, but not in specific. I think with that huge surplus, what Republicans are really going to push is long-term sustained broad tax cuts, that not just for individuals, but the way businesses file and small businesses file, I'm guessing will definitely impact and help and affect small businesses. You know, the frontline worker pay, there's a huge appetite to increase that dollar amount to ramp that up to much more dollars. So it's, you know, maybe more grants and aids and loans and repaying unemployment. But I think, you know, a real clear coalition, when I think of all these freshman interviews or retiree, I did freshman last year, retiree interviews, the best advice, and this came from Alice Hausman in particular, where she said, people need to organize and get together and speak with one voice. And she talked about the year where there are so many different interest groups in housing and nobody was talking with one voice. And that year there were $0 that got through the legislature in housing. And she told the story that she sat down all those advocates in her office and said, don't you ever let this happen again. This is your fault because you all divided and did not form a coalition. After that, there was a housing coalition and all the interest groups came together and spoke with one voice and said, here's what we need. The following year, there was record funding for housing, and there have been huge inroads. So building coalitions, working together, speaking with one voice, making sure somehow that, you know, small business can really coalesce behind a few specific bills and reaching out to lawmakers. And lawmakers will always say, the most valuable voices are from their constituents. They don't want to see the form email that they knew was some mass effort. But when you call up your lawmaker and say, I live here, you represent me, here's what I need.
And Jerry from Deerwood Bank. Jerry, you got a good question. Do you want to ask it?
Here, I unmuted myself there. Yeah, I guess, you know, I in a small version, I'm on a planning commission in a northeastern metro, and I see a little bit of it, but I'm trying to figure out, how do legislators decide which social media posts to pay attention to, and which ones are that mass attempt to sway a vote?
I don't know that social media sways votes. I've still hear from lawmakers that those individual contacts from their actual constituents, you represent me, I live in your district, here's how I feel about it. I still consistently hear that is how lawmakers make up their mind, not necessarily some mass either pro or con movement on social media. You know, social media has kind of turned into an echo chamber. I think lawmakers tend to listen to people who agree with them on social media and in even mass media.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mary. That brings us right to our time, 1 o'clock. I'll turn it back over to our chair, Sabrina.
All right. Well, thank you very much today for Mary. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say we've enjoyed the discussion and the insights. And I hope everybody will join us next month on February 16th when we're joined by Lewis King with a presentation titled Summit 2025, A Bridge to the Middle Class. And we hope to see you all at many of our upcoming chamber events.